Imagine logging into your bank account,
Yeah.
right? But instead of seeing dollars or euros or yen, you see a number representing the exact mathematical value of how much you've helped or harmed the people around you today.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just a totally different metric.
exactly. Like, imagine a world where your access to a mortgage or a new job or even just basic societal trust isn't determined by your credit score. It's determined by this continuously updating ledger of your ethical impact on society.
It's wild to think about. I mean, it fundamentally forces us to reconsider the entire architecture of human interaction. We are just so accustomed to separating the concept of, doing good from the concept of doing well.
Oh, absolutely. We treat ethics like a side project.
Right.
It's a philosophical luxury or like an after-hours charity thing.
Yeah.
But the actual mechanics of survival and status are governed by capital accumulation. Merging those two ledgers requires a total paradigm shift.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us. If you are someone who, loves to peer under the hood of complex systems, you are in the right place.
If you're constantly wondering where our incredibly rapid technological progress is actually steering us, but you want to avoid the exhausting doom scrolling, this is exactly where you want to be.
Yeah, we're skipping the doom today. Well, mostly.
Mostly, yeah. Today's mission is an exploration of a stack of really fascinating, highly disruptive conceptual papers. We're looking at the future trajectories of complex modern societies, specifically the overarching forces like automation, data aggregation, and geopolitical pressure.
And how those forces are driving us towards some very distinct crossroads.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to map those crossroads, we're synthesizing documents that detail three specific systemic trajectories. And the authors use this very particular nomenclature: Objective 00, Objective 10, and Objective 01.
Yeah, and alongside those mathematical designations, we are also dissecting this condensed manifesto that outlines a radical economic framework called Karmatism.
Right, Karmatism, which is where that moral bank account concept comes from. But before we get into that, we really need to decode this terminology. Because to a casual reader, Objective 1001 just looked like, I don't know, arbitrary binary
Oh,
code.
totally. It looks like a computer error.
Yeah. But there's a specific logic to how these futures are named, isn't there?
Yes, there is. And understanding the naming convention really unlocks the entire philosophy of the source material. Think of it as a coordinate system measuring the concentration of societal power.
Okay, a coordinate system.
Right. So the first digit represents centralized top-down control. We're talking monopolies, authoritarian oversight, hyper-concentrated wealth. And the second digit represents distributed, decentralized power. So, democratic accountability, peer-to-peer transparency, shared resources.
Okay, so if we take the first scenario, Objective 00, which the text defines as systemic collapse, that's the origin point. Zero centralized power, zero distributed power. Just nothing exists.
Correct. It is the boundary condition. And what makes this paper's analysis of Objective 1000 so compelling is that it doesn't rely on a Hollywood-style apocalyptic event.
Right, no meteor strikes.
Exactly. No alien invasions.
Yeah.
It frames collapse as the natural mathematical result of cascading failures within our current infrastructure.
A cascading failure. Man, that's the concept that really keeps you up at night when you dig into logistics and supply chains. It's not one localized disaster. It's the realization that we've built a global society with basically zero fire breaks.
Zero. Everything is completely intertwined.
It's like a massive game of Jenga.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, where the blocks are these highly interconnected global systems. So it's like a globally planted monoculture forest. In agriculture, if you plant millions of acres of the exact same genetic crop, it's incredibly efficient for harvesting, right?
Probably efficient, yeah.
But because there is zero genetic diversity, if a single specialized pathogen enters that ecosystem, there are no natural barriers. The entire forest dies at once. Pulling one Jenga block brings the whole thing down because there's limited redundancy.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the vulnerability. I mean, modern civilization has achieved unprecedented efficiency through this economic and technological interdependence. We utilize just-in-time logistics.
Right, warehouses are basically always empty now.
Exactly. Everything is always in transit. We centralize data in a handful of massive server farms, but that efficiency comes at the absolute cost of redundancy. In your monoculture forest analogy, the paper points to specific modern pathogens.
Like what?
Like a targeted cyber attack on maritime shipping communications, or a sudden disruption in the global supply of critical semiconductor components.
Wow. And if one of those critical modes fails, the system doesn't just wobble, it triggers an automated panic, right? Shipping halts, food prices spike in like 48 hours, localized unrest begins.
Which then triggers a geopolitical resource grab, which leads to military posturing. And the text points out that this escalation is now governed by what they call technological acceleration.
Which is the real scary part of Objective 1000.
But it's the ultimate force multiplier here. When you introduce artificial intelligence and autonomous systems into defense or financial resource allocation, the decision-making loop is drastically compressed.
It's too fast for humans to keep up.
Right. We are no longer talking about diplomats having weeks to negotiate a de-escalation. We're talking about critical, world-altering responses being executed by algorithms in fractions of a second. The lack of human latency in the system vastly increases the potential for a localized failure to instantly spiral into global systemic collapse.
So that's the 0-0 coordinate. The monoculture forest burns down. But if we manage to avoid complete collapse, the text presents the next trajectory.
Yeah.
Objective 1, there's a...
Yeah, the cautionary trajectory.
Right, and going back to your coordinate explanation, the 1 means absolute centralized power, and the 0 means zero distributed accountability. The text calls this the concentration of power.
It is the scenario where technological scale, economic incentives, and policy all just seamlessly align to centralize authority. Wealth accumulates at the very apex of society, surveillance expands to monitor every human interaction, and algorithms are hyper-optimized for engagement.
Mostly behavioral manipulation, really. But let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
How is Objective 1 Seer any different from the trajectory we were already on? Like, when I read the description of wealth hoarding and algorithmic manipulation, it doesn't sound like a speculative sci-fi future. It sounds like a remarkably accurate description of late-stage capitalism right now.
Well, you're not wrong. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Objective 1 Seer isn't a sudden departure from our current reality. It is the terminal endpoint of our current incentive structures.
The logical conclusion of business as usual.
Exactly. The paper outlines 7 distinct phases of progression toward this reality. We are arguably deep into the early phases, like consolidation and dependency. That's where a handful of massive tech platforms become indispensable utilities for human interaction, yet remain entirely privately controlled.
And from there, the text moves into what it calls compression. This is where the middle class feels the absolute crush of wage stagnation and job displacement driven by automation. Again, something you can read about in the business section today.
Yes, but where it shifts from our current frustrations into the inescapable reality of Objective 1-0 is in Phase 5, which they call reinforcement. This is where the underlying logic of the system just locks into place permanently.
Feedback.
Right, an ironclad feedback loop. Dominant actors accumulate vast amounts of behavioral data. They use that data to algorithmically shape the information ecosystem, dictating what the public sees, fears, and values.
Wow.
And that informational control grants them immense political influence, which they use to capture regulatory bodies, thereby ensuring their continued extraction of wealth and data.
It's a completely closed loop. Data buys influence, influence buys policy, policy secures wealth, wealth buys more data. But I want to pause on the algorithmic shaping of the information ecosystem. Why do the algorithms in a 1000 reality prioritize outrage and division?
That's a crucial point.
The text notes this, but it's really important to understand the mechanism behind it. The algorithms aren't inherently evil, are they?
No, they aren't evil. They are simply ruthlessly efficient at fulfilling their programmed mandate, which is to maximize shareholder value.
Just following orders.
Exactly. In the current iteration of the internet, the underlying business model is attention capture. To extract capital from advertising, you must extract human time. And human neurobiology dictates that fear, tribalism, and outrage are the stickiest, most engaging emotions.
Right, the negativity bias.
Yes. So the algorithm optimizes for division not out of malice, but because division is the most efficient fuel for capital extraction.
Which leads directly to Phase 6, stratification. The society permanently settles into distinct, impenetrable tiers. Social mobility basically dies. And that ushers in Phase 7, which the text brilliantly and terrifyingly terms soft constraint.
Soft constraint is fascinating. It's the ultimate evolution of authoritarianism because it completely removes the need for physical force.
You don't need a police state if the system controls your choices.
Right. The paper explains that formal democratic rights might still exist on paper. You have the freedom of speech, the freedom to vote, the freedom to travel, But practical limitations are imposed through pervasive surveillance and immense economic pressure.
So you're quote-unquote free to make choices.
You're free, but the algorithmic and economic walls around you are so precisely engineered that you only ever choose the path that the centralized powers have laid out for you.
It's invisible fencing for human beings. You don't see the barrier until you try to cross it, and then your credit access is suddenly limited, or your digital visibility is throttled.
Right.
So to map this out for you, the listener, on one hand, we have the systemic collapse of Yao0. On the other, we have the heavily surveilled, perfectly stratified oligarchy of 100. The entire premise of these source documents is that the natural drift of our unguided systems leans heavily toward 100. To avoid it, society requires intentional, radical design.
And that intentional design is Objective 01, the 0 meaning no centralized monopoly on power, and the 1 representing fully distributed accountability.
The constructive trajectory. This is a scenario where transparency, participation, and accountability are actively strengthened through technology. Instead of algorithms feeding on outrage to generate ad revenue, they are structurally reoriented to promote diversity, novelty, and constructive discourse.
Power is actively decentralized, but the critical question is how.
Right.
You cannot simply ask massive centralized tech monopolies and financial institutions to voluntarily decentralize their own power out of the goodness of their hearts. Objective 01 cannot exist within our current economic paradigm. To prevent a 1-0 reality, society needs an entirely new economic engine.
One that fundamentally alters the incentive structure of human interaction. If the problem is that our current system only rewards capital accumulation and ignores ethical externalities, the solution has to be a system that quantifies and rewards ethics.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the core of our deep dive.
Yeah.
The Manifesto on Karmatism.
Yes. Karmatism is described in the text as an economic and ethical framework for a conscious society. The very first thing we must clarify to avoid immediate misunderstanding is that it does not advocate for the abolition of fiat currency. It does not replace the dollar or the euro or basic property rights.
So you still have a traditional bank account. You still buy groceries with money.
Yes, but it introduces a secondary parallel layer of value, a moral feedback system. The text uses terms like karma points or Samaritan points.
I like Samaritan point.
Yeah, it has a good ring to it. It tracks and quantifies how your actions affect the broader community. Positive actions like mentorship, environmental stewardship, creating equitable workplace policies increase your karma. Harmful actions, exploitation, deceptive marketing, environmental degradation decrease it.
And this is where the mechanics of karmatism separate it from just being, a glorified customer loyalty program. The text emphasizes a principle called dynamic value. Karma points decay over time.
That decay mechanism is the absolute genius of the system. It mathematically ensures that ethical behavior must be an ongoing practice, not a static achievement.
I think about it like a moral fitness tracker. If your goal is to run a marathon, you have to train consistently, right? If you ran a marathon 3 years ago, and since then you've just been sitting on the couch eating junk food, you aren't physically fit today. You can't point to a 3-year-old medal and demand to be treated like an elite athlete. Your physical capital has decayed.
That's a perfect analogy.
In karmatism, you cannot rely on the ethical marathon you ran in the past. To maintain high karma and the societal trust that comes with it, you have to put in the reps today, tomorrow, and the next day.
And if we apply that analogy to corporate behavior, it completely disrupts the current public relations model. Today, a corporation can commit massive environmental damage, pay a fine that amounts to a fraction of their profits, make one highly publicized philanthropic donation, and then coast on that manufactured goodwill for a decade.
Oh, greenwashing at its finest.
Exactly. The decay mechanism of karmatism eliminates moral coasting. Your past good deeds evaporate. The system asks, what are you doing for the community this quarter?
We also need to be very clear about the baseline guarantees in this system, because the moment you start talking about tracking behavior, the shadow of a dystopian social credit system looms large.
Very large.
But the manifesto explicitly states that basic human needs are walled off from the karma system. Food, shelter, foundational health care. These are guaranteed rights. You do not get turned away from an emergency room because your Samaritan points are in the negative.
Furthermore, karma cannot be commodified. It cannot be bought with fiat currency, it cannot be sold on an exchange, and it cannot be inherited by your children. It is tied strictly to your individual or organizational actions.
Is non-transferable.
Exactly. Its utility lies entirely in influence. A high karma score unlocks societal trust. It might dictate your eligibility for leadership roles, your access to premium communal resources, or the level of public investment your business can secure.
To really understand how revolutionary this is, we should look at the comparative table the manifesto lays out. It contrasts Karmatism directly against our historical economic models. It argues that capitalism prioritizes profit generation and the rights of ownership. Socialism prioritizes the equitable distribution of resources. But Karmatism prioritizes impact, ethical responsibility, and constructive contribution.
It creates an entirely new axis of measurement. The manifesto contains a striking assertion. Socialism redistributes wealth. Karmatism redefines what wealth actually is.
That redefinition is the exact bug fix our current operating system so desperately needs. I mean, let's look at the real world right now. Under a purely capitalist metric, it is entirely possible and incredibly common for an entity to succeed financially while actively harming the fabric of society.
Oh, it happens constantly.
Right. You can build a social media app that deliberately degrades the mental health of teenagers, and if it generates high ad revenue, you are rewarded with billions in market capitalization. You are deemed successful. Conversely, you can be a public defender, a hospice nurse, or a community organizer, generating massive, tangible value for society and struggle to afford a mortgage.
Because the current ledger is blind. It only sees the flow of capital. It cannot see the destruction or creation of social cohesion. And this brings us to a really fascinating speculative question. Should capitalism take this next evolutionary step?
It's a huge question.
We have already commodified and capitalized nearly every abstract concept imaginable. Human attention, personal data, future risk. Is it time to capitalize morality? If non-material metrics like trust, reliability, and societal impact were integrated into the formal economy, we might finally align financial success with positive human outcomes.
It essentially argues that relying solely on profit as a measure of a society's health is like trying to fly a 747 using only the fuel gauge while ignoring the altimeter and the pitch sensors. Eventually, you're going to crash into a mountain. Karmatism provides the missing instruments.
Yeah, the missing instruments. I like that.
But let's ground this in reality for a second. Morality is notoriously subjective. What I consider a good deed might seem entirely trivial or even counterproductive to someone from a different cultural background.
Sure.
If we're going to build an economy on Samaritan points, how on earth do you apply this fairly across an entire society without it feeling like an arbitrary, top-down moral dictatorship?
Well, the architects of Karmatism recognized this subjectivity. To prevent the system from becoming a blunt, tyrannical instrument, they designed it around sector-based application. Karma is entirely contextual.
So it changes depending on where you are.
Yes. The metrics used to calculate ethical impact change depending on the specific environment you are operating in.
Which makes perfect sense, because how you measure the ethical contribution of an emergency room surgeon is wildly different from how you measure the ethical contribution of a software engineer or a construction worker.
Precisely. The text provides specific sector examples. In the realm of healthcare, the Karma algorithms would heavily weight metrics of compassion, patient dignity, and caregiving. It moves beyond just clinical efficiency, like, did the patient survive, to the holistic experience of empathy.
Wow, quantifying empathy, that's heavy.
It is. In education, Samaritan points are generated through mentorship, the sharing of proprietary knowledge, and the measurable empowerment of students.
And when you move it to the corporate sector, the metrics shift again. Here, Karma tracks fairness and compensation, supply chain transparency, and collaborative innovation. In civic life, it measures active community support and localized problem solving.
And the most vital sector, in my opinion, given the threat of Objective 1.0, is the online space.
Oh, absolutely.
In digital environments, Karma directly rewards respectful, constructive engagement. It actively penalizes deception, trolling, and the amplification of outrage.
By heavily contextualizing the metrics, sector-based application ensures that individuals are evaluated on the specific ethical demands of their actual daily lives rather than a universal abstract moral code.
Yes, exactly.
But defining the metrics is only half the battle. How do you maintain the stability of an economy that is constantly shifting between the pursuit of capital and the pursuit of karma? To address this, the manifesto introduces a massive macroeconomic mechanism, the rotating currency system, or RCS.
The RCS. The text frames this as the necessary transitional model. You can't just flip a switch overnight and expect global markets to suddenly care about Samaritan points.
Right. The markets would freak out.
Total panic. So the RCS acts as a set of training wheels, utilizing 3 color-coded phases to handle economic cycles and prevent runaway accumulation. The first phase is the green phase. This represents growth and trust.
So this is kind of like what we have now.
Somewhat, yes. During a green phase, the economy operates similarly to how it does today. It is a period of stable, productive contribution. Innovation is rewarded, financial capital flows freely, and the primary focus is on building and expanding.
But unlike our current system, the green phase is not infinite. Eventually, the system transitions into the yellow phase, which is dedicated to reflection and adjustment. The text notes that this phase intentionally slows excess and encourages ethical recalibration. And finally, there is the red phase, a period of support and recovery. This phase is triggered to provide temporary assistance, allowing marginalized sectors or individuals to rebuild lost trust and societal standing.
The explicit purpose of these cycles is to act as systemic safeguards against the concentration of power seen in Objective 1 narratives. The authors of Karmatism argue that perpetual, unmitigated growth without enforced periods of reflection is a mathematical impossibility. It inevitably leads to systemic collapse, Objective Thou's 0, 0.
Right, the Jenga tower falls.
Yes. By legally mandating a yellow phase, the system intentionally cools down the machinery of capital extraction to check the ethical gauges of society.
If we think back to the monoculture forest analogy, the RCS is the equivalent of crop rotation. For the last century, global capitalism has essentially been planting corn in the exact same field year after year, decade after decade.
Relentlessly.
The green phase is that high-yield cash crop. But if you never stop planting corn, you entirely deplete the nitrogen in the soil. The land dies and you get a dust bowl. The yellow and red phases are the periods where you plant legumes to return nutrients to the earth, or you simply let the field lie fallow. You have to let the societal soil recover.
And that biological analogy is incredibly apt because it highlights the necessity of rest and recalibration for long-term survival. However, we have to look at the immense friction of implementing this.
Yeah, let's talk about the friction.
How does a yellow phase actually function on a practical level? If the global economy enters a period of reflection, does a massive logistics company just stop delivering packages? Does a tech giant freeze all product launches for 6 months just to audit their algorithms for bias?
That is the friction. Imagine the panic on Wall Street if the government announced, next quarter, we are entering a yellow phase. GDP growth is no longer the target, corporate empathy is. Shareholders would riot.
They absolutely would, which is why the RCS likely requires a massive shift in macroeconomic incentives rather than just relying on corporate goodwill.
How so?
Well, during a yellow phase, the taxation structure would likely invert. The generation of traditional financial wealth might face steep progressive taxes, while the generation of Samaritan points through community repair, environmental cleanup, or debt forgiveness would be heavily subsidized.
Oh, I see.
The state, or the decentralized governance body, would artificially alter the gravity of the market. It forces capital to flow toward ethical maintenance rather than raw expansion.
I see the vision, and structurally, it is a brilliant countermeasure to late-stage capitalism. But we have to address the towering, terrifying obstacles standing in the way of this entire framework.
The surveillance issue.
Yeah, to measure compassion in a hospital, to measure fairness in a boardroom, to track constructive engagement online across millions of users.
Yeah.
You need data, an unfathomable, granular, omnipresent stream of behavioral data. And that brings us to the panopticon problem.
It is the single greatest vulnerability of the entire theoretical framework, and to the credit of the Objective 01 authors, they do not hide from it.
No, they lean right into it.
They do. In their section detailing trade-offs and risks, the foremost concern is the privacy paradox. The text plainly states, increased transparency and distributed accountability may inherently reduce personal privacy.
Because if we get this wrong, if the data collection becomes centralized or opaque, we don't arrive at the utopia of Objective 01. We instantly rubber stamp the dystopian surveillance state of Objective 10. You just hand the keys of human behavior over to a centralized authority.
Exactly.
So how does the Karmatist Manifesto propose we build this moral tracking system without creating a digital prison?
The manifesto relies on a very strict, uncompromising set of safeguards and design principles. First and foremost, the system must be strictly voluntary. It is an opt-in architecture. No citizen is forced to participate in the tracking of Samaritan points.
Okay, I want to push back on that immediately, but let's hear the rest of the safeguards first.
Fair enough. The second safeguard is absolute transparency. The algorithms calculating your karma cannot be hidden in a proprietary black box, the way current social media algorithms are guarded as corporate secrets. The mathematical weights and measures must be open source and publicly verifiable.
Okay, open source morality.
Third, it demands decentralized oversight. No single entity, not a federal government, not a tech conglomerate, has the authority to define the moral metrics. It is managed through a distributed, likely blockchain-based democratic consensus.
Got it.
Finally, it ensures the right to appeal any score and guarantees that there are no permanent judgments. Due to the decay mechanism, recovery and redemption are mathematically built into the system.
Okay, those principles sound great on paper. Transparency, decentralization, the right to appeal. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
I have to return to the first safeguard. The system is voluntary.
Yes.
If I am an exploitative actor, if I run a multinational corporation that generates billions in profit by quietly dumping toxic waste and utilizing quasi-slave labor in my supply chain, why on earth would I ever opt in?
You wouldn't.
Right. The very people driving us toward the Objective 1000 nightmare are the ones who benefit the most from remaining in the shadows. If the ruthless actors simply opt out of karmatism, the system has no teeth. It just becomes a fun, gamified social club for nice people, while the sociopaths continue to run the actual world.
That is a highly logical critique. But if we analyze the mechanics of network effects, the system doesn't necessarily need to point a gun at bad actors to force compliance. It utilizes market dynamics and the currency of social trust to create inescapable leverage.
Explain that.
Imagine a scenario where karmatism achieves critical mass among the general public and the workforce. A verified, transparent karma score becomes the foundational prerequisite for economic trust.
So that it becomes a filter.
Exactly. If you are a massive corporation that refuses to opt in, meaning you categorically refuse to allow your supply chain, your labor practices, and your environmental impact to be transparently measured, that refusal becomes a massive, blaring red flag to the market.
The absence of a score is a score.
Right. Consumers will shift their spending to verified, high-karma competitors. Top-tier engineering and creative talent will refuse to work for an unverified entity, knowing it could damage their own Samaritan standing. You don't have to participate in the system, but if you choose not to, you effectively exile yourself from the trust-based economy.
It's like a restaurant that refuses a health inspection. A city doesn't necessarily have to shut the restaurant down immediately. But if every other restaurant on the street has a giant illuminated A grade in their window, and your window is completely blank, the market is going to make an assumption about what's happening in your kitchen. Eventually, you go out of business.
That is the intended mechanism. However, even if you solve the adoption problem, what's fascinating here is that the Objective 01 paper highlights a monumental technical hurdle known as moral quantification.
The bias problem.
Yes. How do you translate the infinite nuances of human behavior into cold, hard code? Even if the system is completely transparent and decentralized, measuring ethical behavior is profoundly subjective. How do you prevent the algorithm from encoding the biases of its creators?
Because if the metrics are decided by democratic consensus, doesn't that just invite the tyranny of the majority? Let's take a hypothetical. Imagine a town that is split 51 to 49% on a deeply controversial social issue.
A very common scenario.
Right. If the 51% gets to dictate the local sector metrics for what constitutes good behavior, they can essentially weaponize the karma system to socially bankrupt the 49% minority.
The paper explicitly categorizes this undervalue conflicts. Differing cultural, religious, and political frameworks will inevitably clash when forced to share a unified economic architecture.
It's bound to happen.
If a deeply conservative community and a highly progressive community are interacting within the same regional RCS, how do they agree on the numerical Samaritan value of a specific action? Can the decentralized ledger support forking moral frameworks where different communities utilize different ethical weightings? Or does that destroy the universal trust the system is trying to build?
It's mathematically and socially dizzying. And that doesn't even touch on what the paper calls system complexity.
Which is the sheer computational and bureaucratic nightmare of maintaining this. To keep a decentralized ledger secure, transparent, and instantly responsive to appeals across billions of daily human interactions requires a level of coordination that introduces massive inefficiencies.
It's a logistical mountain.
Designing a system robust enough to resist capture by the powerful, yet flexible enough to respect diverse, localized cultural values, all without collapsing under its own computational weight, is arguably the ultimate engineering challenge of the 21st century.
But let's look at the alternative. If we throw our hands up and say, quantifying ethics is too hard, the value conflicts are too messy, what is the default result?
The default result is that we slide backward into the frictionless, highly efficient concentration of power.
We slide right into Objective 1.0, where a handful of executives simply impose their values on us through opaque algorithms anyway. So if we decide that the stratified, softly constrained dystopia of 1.0 is unacceptable, we have to endure the friction of building 0.1. How do we actually transition society? What are the practical steps?
The Objective 01 paper lays out a comprehensive roadmap for this transition, detailing 7 phases of progression toward distributed accountability. And importantly, they don't frame this as a peaceful overnight awakening. It is a process of intense societal friction and adaptation.
Let's break down that friction, because moving an entire global population from a capital-centric mindset to a karma-centric mindset is going to break some eggs.
Definitely. The journey begins with phase 1, access expansion. Before you can ask a global population to meaningfully participate in a complex, decentralized moral economy, you have to level the baseline of educational and technological access. You cannot have distributed accountability if half the population lacks the tools to hold anyone accountable.
Makes sense. How do they propose we do that?
The text suggests that the proliferation of advanced AI tutors and remote learning platforms will radically expand access to complex systems thinking.
Which naturally threatens legacy institutions. If education is no longer a scarce resource gatekept by elite universities, the monopoly on expertise begins to crack. And that leads to phase 2, which is visibility.
Right, visibility. As the populace becomes more educated and connected, they begin to demand to see how the machinery of society actually works. The black boxes are pried open. Institutional processes, supply chains, and algorithmic decision-making become increasingly transparent.
And that transparency inevitably exposes massive inefficiencies, corruption, and systemic biases that were previously hidden. The public exposure creates outrage, but not the paralyzing outrage of the one-of-you algorithm. It creates activating outrage, which pushes society into phase 3, participation.
Participation is where the real shift begins. Voting, governance, and feedback are no longer static events that happen every 2 or 4 years at a ballot box. Mechanisms for input massively expand. Citizens begin continuously influencing local resource allocation and institutional policy through secure digital platforms.
But here is where the model faces its most potent human obstacle. In the expert analysis section of the text, there is a glaring warning about something called participation fatigue.
Yes, and it is a deeply pragmatic critique. Human beings have limited cognitive bandwidth. We are simply not biologically wired to be hyper-engaged, constantly evaluating citizens. If my daily life requires me to vote on municipal water allocation every Tuesday, audit my local school board's curriculum every Thursday, and constantly monitor my own ethical impact metrics just to maintain my societal standing, I am going to burn out. The sheer administrative load of living in a hyper-democratic 0-1 society could easily overwhelm the average person.
It sounds utterly exhausting. If I have a toddler, a demanding job, and aging parents, the last thing I want to do at 9:00 p.m. is log on to a decentralized ledger to debate the Samaritan point value of my neighborhood's recycling program. I'd rather just let a politician handle it.
Which is exactly how we ended up with centralized power in the first place.
Exactly. Does the framework offer any mechanism to relieve this fatigue?
It does, through a concept the authors call automation as exposure. The theory is that as AI and advanced robotics handle the vast majority of mundane, repetitive, and administrative labor, massive amounts of human cognitive bandwidth are freed up.
So AI handles the busy work.
Right. The automation doesn't just replace jobs, it acts as an exposure mechanism, revealing inefficiencies and shifting the primary domain of human labor away from manual drudgery and toward roles that emphasize creativity, complex judgment, and ethical decision-making.
So the argument is that we will have the energy to participate in a karmatist economy because we won't be exhausted by the 40-hour grind of the capitalist economy. Assuming society can bridge that gap and manage the fatigue, we arrive at phase 4. Integration. The continuous feedback from the populace is systematically incorporated into formal governance structures. The decentralized input actually begins to steer the ship.
Which sets the stage for the true paradigm shift. Phase 5, value transformation. This is the tipping point where karmatism fully takes root. The societal definition of value officially broadens.
So it's not just about money anymore.
Exactly. Samaritan points emerged from being a localized experimental metric to becoming a universally recognized supplementary indicator of value, standing alongside and in some cases superseding financial metrics.
And I want to highlight something incredible about Phase 5. If we look at how this impacts the media and information ecosystem, it completely bankrupts the objective one-number reality. We discussed how, right now, algorithms feed on outrage because outrage generates attention and attention generates capital.
Yes, the closed loop we talked about earlier.
But in a Phase 5 society, the core definition of societal wealth has transformed. If society literally stops rewarding outrage and starts rewarding constructive, nuanced discourse with actual, tangible Samaritan points, points that dictate your societal access and trust the incentive structure of the internet flips, the business model of polarization is suddenly starved of oxygen.
It is the ultimate systemic countermeasure. You don't have to censor the outrage, you simply change the economic gravity so that outrage is no longer profitable. The algorithms are reoriented toward empathy and novelty because the underlying economic incentive demands it.
That's amazing.
And this leads directly to Phase 6, power distribution. Because ethical impact is now a quantifiable prerequisite for influence, the ability of purely financial actors to dominate society is neutralized. Power naturally balances out across a wider array of diverse, high-karma contributors.
And finally, Phase 7, cultural reinforcement. The transition is complete. The norms of distributed accountability, transparency, and ethical responsibility are no longer enforced by an external tracking system. They become deeply embedded within the culture itself. It becomes the unquestioned default of human interaction.
To synthesize this entire journey, Karmatism is the necessary economic engine that makes the objective 0-1 trajectory possible. It halts the runaway concentration of power by ensuring that any attempt to hoard resources without making a proportional ethical contribution results in a devastating loss of societal trust.
It breaks the cycle.
It does. It replaces the vicious, closed loop of one-then-zero consolidation with a virtuous, expanding cycle of distributed accountability.
It's a profound shift in perspective. It asserts that our rapid technological progress, the AI, the data collection, the algorithmic sorting, does not inherently doom us to either the terminal collapse of Objective 1000R or the stratified, surveilled oligarchy of Objective 10. The tools themselves are morally neutral.
Completely neutral.
We can choose to use those exact same technologies to design a system that structurally demands and rewards our better angels.
It is a reminder that the future is not something that simply happens to us. It is a built environment. And the blueprints for that environment are being drafted right now, largely through the code we are writing and the economic incentives we are normalizing today.
Which brings us to the most important part of this deep dive, what this means for you, the listener. We've explored the absolute extremes of where our society could be heading. On one side of the knife's edge, the Jenga tower collapses into the chaotic void of 000.
A very dark path.
And on the other side, we are safely, comfortably imprisoned in the soft constraints of 10, where our data is weaponized to keep us endlessly scrolling and perfectly compliant.
And right in the middle is the incredibly difficult, friction-filled, but profoundly hopeful path of 0-1. A world that requires active, daily participation, where your ethical impact is visible and valued, guided by the rotating cycles of reflection and growth.
Why does this abstract conceptual stuff matter to your life today? Because the infrastructure for these futures is actively being poured. The artificial intelligence models being trained on your data, the supply chain logistics being automated, the social media algorithms dictating what you see. These are the foundation stones.
They are the building block.
We are currently deciding what constitutes value in the 21st century. Are we going to remain loyal to a system that only measures capital, or are we going to demand a system that measures humanity?
The decisions made by technologists, policymakers, and consumers over the next few years will inevitably lock us into one of these trajectories.
And so we return to the image we started with, that messy, murky landscape of human worth slowly merging with the clean, undeniable math of a ledger. I want to leave you with a specific, lingering question to turn over in your mind. Think about your life exactly as it is structured right now.
Your job, your habits.
Your consumption habits, the way you speak to people online, the way you participate in your local community. If you woke up tomorrow and a completely transparent, flawlessly accurate Karmatism system was activated. Wait, no, if it was just turned on, suddenly. If every action started generating decaying Samaritan points that your friends, family, and employers could see, how much of your daily routine would you urgently need to change just to maintain the level of societal trust you currently take for granted?
It is a thought experiment that forces a deeply uncomfortable but entirely necessary personal audit.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of our future. Keep questioning the systems around you, stay fiercely curious, and we will catch you next time.